Nationalism, that is to say, the ideology based around the belief in self-governing nation-states, is heavily dependent upon language in a way perhaps more than any other political philosophy. Before this, the predominant political philosophies centered around empires, feudal hierarchies, and so on, so that land, and with it populations, could shift back and forth between rulers with relative fluidity. After all, it isn't as if those people were choosing their own leaders. The idea, then, of German or Italian states unifying was in some ways an odd one for a long time, but not only for political reasons. Of course, it is not easy to overhaul an entire political system, but considering that these people would not have been traveling very far in their whole lives, well, really it wouldn't have mattered. Communities not only developed personal identities, but there was no one sense of language in particular. You can hear more about it in the What's a Language video, but basically the idea of a standard variety of language is an invented concept, and usually there is a sort of gradient called a dialect continuum where people in neighboring towns can understand each other, but from a certain number of settlements over, it becomes less and less true. Certainly, border regions have always existed, that's for sure, where different languages were always different, and hence borders made sense between them to an extent. But within language families, this is not so obvious. Looking to Europe, for major language families, we have Romance, Germanic, and especially Slavic languages, where even modern border regions between, for example, Germany and the Netherlands, or Poland and Slovakia, have little clear linguistic division. With a national standard language, there's very little that can be considered natural about it, and with the exception of language isolates like Hungarian, Korean, Japanese, wherein those linguistic communities are not surrounded by people speaking related languages, there is not always a clear way to mark linguistic boundaries. These days especially, it's slightly easier in places because of the adoption of a national language which has come at the expense of regional dialects, as has happened, for example, in the border region between France and Spain with the diminished use of Occitan, a dialect of French, but it's got a lot of influence from Spanish as opposed to the Parisian French that is favored. Indeed, these sorts of cases, what one needs to form a standard variety of language involves a few different things. Some of them are more arbitrary, like a dictionary, creations of which sharply increased in the 18th and 19th centuries, where the authors have some license to choose what does or doesn't get included, or especially dedicated bodies for national standardization, like l'Académie Française, whose members, fun fact, are called les immortels, the immortals, which gives you a sort of hint about how they perceive language change over time. They're not positive about it. However, there are other, arguably more natural ways that people can look to nationalize a language, and this includes looking to literary history, in use in politics, relative population size for given dialects, or measures like this. It's all useful in other ways besides merely political, such as educational or, for example, even second language learners and nation-state building. They all need different uses of a national standard language. In movements from German to Italian to Indonesian nationalism, the establishment of a national language was instrumental, as seen in the slogan "One Country, Indonesia, One People, Indonesian, and One Language, Bahasa Indonesia." Language was key to Indonesian nationalism, despite the country containing literally hundreds of languages. Likewise, German nationalism, especially around the character of Frederick the Great, started, as Hans Ulrich Weller puts it, debate about the German national literature, a German national theater, and die Pflege einer deutschen Nationalsprache, the maintenance of a German national language. Indeed, this is still relevant for newly independent countries, such as those now free from the USSR, which are strongly pushing their own national languages in school, in trade, in politics, which were formerly dominated by Russian. In Azerbaijan, for example, they invented a letter schwa for their alphabet. Mongolia announced just a few weeks ago that it would be dropping Cyrillic instead of having now its new traditional script in use, and Kazakhstan did that as well with Latin. This is to help diminish Russian soft power, but also to increase nationalism in those respective countries. Historically speaking, people opted for regionalism. So for many different groups, the idea of living in a country filled with a sort of generally undefined ethnic makeup was alien. As T.E. Lawrence wrote, as he tried to inspire Arab revolutions against the Ottoman Turks in World War I, Syria and Syrian are foreign words. Unless he has learned English or French, the inhabitant of these parts of the world has no word to describe his country. Syria in Turkish, the word does not exist in Arabic, is the province of Damascus. An Aleppine always calls himself an Aleppine, a Beiruti, and so down to the smallest villages. There is no national feeling. Of course, there would eventually be Arab nationalism, as seen just a few later and more recently in the Arab Spring, but this isn't totally a history channel, and that's a little bit beyond the scope of this. This process is not universal, however, and there are many countries where national sentiment is centered around bilingualism, for example, but however, this is more complicated, such as with Canada, which sees both separatist nationalist movements, especially in Quebec, where French is dominant, but also an aspect of national sentiment that is centered around non-Americanness, as I've been told. Another slightly exceptional example might be that of the 19th century Jewish nationalist movement. This was more multilingual and geographically more spread out than was the case with other European national movements. By far the most commonly spoken language, though, was Yiddish. However, it was Hebrew, not the more commonly used language of Yiddish, which was adopted as the national ethnic language of the Jew. However, in this case, like Latin had been to many Western and Central European countries in the Middle Ages, until around the 17th century, Hebrew was the main literary and liturgical language for Jews, so Yiddish-based institutions, like national theaters and literature, were less dominant until much later anyway. Of course, this is a complicated subject, but if I had to boil it down, I would say it like this. Nations and nation-states need to have a coherent sense of culture in order to reduce civil unrest and to communicate effectively with citizens as one mostly unified body. A language is arguably the most important way to create a sense of group identity. Politics, language, culture, it's all mixed together. If you want to stay up to date with posts like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth looks into language. Again, there is now merchandise including t-shirts, a mug, and a sticker, so check those out to support this channel, or support directly via Patreon for other benefits as well. For daily posts, visit wordfacts.org. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.